Okay, so that might seem a little bit tricky, functions calling other functions, but I promise you'll get used to it pretty quickly. So let's go on to the next section here, and we're going to discover a whole bunch of functions that already exist that we can use and we don't have to create for ourselves. And this is important because if we don't use these pre-existing functions, we're going to spend a lot of unnecessary time creating our own functions. So, think of that man who built a house in the forest and he used the house for a day. Tomorrow comes around, well, guess what? He still can use that same house. That house still exists, and there's no reason to create a new house. So let's discover these modules or these libraries of pre-existing functions. Now it says here, before we try doing anything fancy, try using the square root function. So we're going to go ahead, and I think this is a typo here, py, ask Python to print the square root, and we should get an error. So I'm going to put this on line 3. Okay, so let's print, and we want to print the square root of 25. Okay, so let's get the brackets right, and we go ahead and run it. And of course, it tells us that this function doesn't exist. The square root function is not defined. I think there's a small typo here which might confuse you even more. This py, that probably doesn't need to be there. So let's go and see where this square root function is hiding. Okay, so in this assignment here, in this exercise, what we're going to do is we're going to import the math library or the math module. Now this is like any library, it has a whole bunch of documents in there. In this case, those documents are defined functions. So let's go ahead and import it. Import math, okay, on line 2, and then insert math right before the square root function. So where do we find the square root function? We find it inside the math library. And then I think we're ready to execute it. So I click run, and I find the square root of 25 is just 5. Now, square root failed previously. If we go back to the previous screen, it failed previously because there was no square root function that it knew about. However, there is a square root function that exists inside the math module, and what we did is we just simply grabbed that function out of the module to be able to do that. Now, in the next section, section 9, what we're doing is we're just going to pull out one function. We're going to import it out of a module. Okay, so we're going to grab, let's say, I think in this case it's going to be square root, and we're going to pull it out of math, and we're going to use the following format. So on line 3, okay, we need to follow the lines here. In line 3, we're going to begin by typing import, from the math library. What you want to do is you want to import the square root function, and I think in this case you don't need to mention those brackets. That's unnecessary. That's going to bring it into us, and then we can use the square root function over and over again. So let's click run, and accepted it. We'll go on to the next one. And then there's a universal import. So, but this here is not considered a best practice. So let me copy this into WordPad so you can see exactly what we're doing here. So we're importing star. Now star means all. It means everything. all the functions from a given library or module. Now you can do that, but the problem is, let's say you're defining your own function, you're creating a function higher than, okay, but without even realizing it, the exact function with the exact same name maybe does something different, but a function of the exact same name already exists. So that is something we need to think about. Do we really want to grab all the functions out of a library? So let's go ahead and do this example here. So on line 3, we're going to grab some stuff from the math library. And what are we going to import from the math library? We're going to import everything. And how do you represent everything? With a star. So let's go ahead and run this. And now we have access to everything that exists inside the math library, not just the square root function, but sine functions, just about anything you can imagine. So let's click next. And we have a little warning here that this can be dangerous. You don't want to import more stuff than you really need, because then, without even realizing it, you could be defining a function or using a function name that already exists. Okay, so on this slide here, slide 11, the code in the editor will show you everything that's available in the math library. Click run to check it out, and you'll see the square root function along with some other math functions. So let's take a look at what we're doing here. So we're importing the math library, okay, and we want to list everything that's there. So let's go ahead and run this. And here are all the different functions, and if we look at it, it is alphabetical. We can see the square root function, but we also see the sine function and a whole bunch of other math functions that we are bringing in. Here's the problem. Maybe you want to create your own tan function. Okay, maybe tan for you means getting at suntan, but you imported the math library. So then you have a conflict. You now have two tan functions. So let's go on to the next one. And in this one, we're going to go beyond strings. Okay, so what we want to do here is, what do you think the code in the editor will do? So let's read it and find out. So I'm going to copy it and paste it into WordPad, and we'll read through it line by line. So definition, biggest, okay, and star arguments, okay. So we're going to print that out, and we're going to return the value. So if we look at what we're printing, okay, we're printing the max, or the largest one. So if we have a lot of numbers here and we apply the max function, okay, the max function will print out the largest one in that list. So that's the definition of biggest number function. Now let's go down and see where it's being used. So here we're calling the biggest number function, and we're passing 4 numbers, -10, -5, 5, and 10. So those numbers get passed up with the star args. That's how you do it. Star means all, so everything or all the arguments get passed in. We're going to look for the maximum number. The maximum number, of course, is 10. And likewise with smallest, we're going to be using the min function. With this one over here, the absolute, so we're going to ignore the minus. So it doesn't matter whether it's minus or positive. So let's go ahead and run this. And sure enough, for each of those, we get the appropriate value for those functions. 10 for the biggest number in that list, maximum number, -10 for the minimum, and 10 for the absolute value, largest absolute value. And here we're going to, I guess, use some sort of max function. So try out the max function on line number 3 of the editor. You can provide any number of integer or float. So let's go ahead and try this out here. So set the maximum to the max value of any set of numbers. So I'm going to type out here max, open bracket, and let's put in some numbers, 5, 5, 3 or 2, and 26. And for fun, let's just put in a negative number. So I'm going to put in the number -7. So I'm going to highlight these numbers because we're probably going to be using the same numbers over and over again. So print out the maximum. Okay, we click run. And we get an error on line number 3. So let's take a look at this, see what our error is. Yes, I put a period instead of a comma, so that's important. When we get these errors, first thing we need to do is we need to try to identify the line. And then we go to that line, and then you'll see a little arrow there, and it is kind of pointing to what might be wrong. So just look just before or just after that little arrow, and you can see here that I put a period instead of a comma. So let's go ahead and run it again. Okay, we got another error. Okay, and this time again in line number 3. And in line number 3, it looks like I made a typo. You just have to look carefully. It's not max 5, it's just max. So we'll correct that and we'll run it again. So that's something we have to get used to. I make tons of errors when I'm coding, and I just simply have to go through those error messages and try to figure out what went wrong. We'll go on to the next one, very similar. So we're going to have the min of a list. So let's apply the min function, and I'm going to paste in those same numbers, 5, 2, 26, and -7. And of course, in this case, the minimum number is going to be -7. So we click run, and I am making an error again. Same error. We have to put a comma in there. Let's highlight it. Control C to copy. So let's run it one more time, and this time we have the -7 with no errors. We'll do another one now. Last one, the absolute function. So here we don't care if it's a minus or a positive. So let's go ahead and type ABS. We copy and paste those numbers in there, and of course the biggest number there, absolute number, is going to be 26. We run it, and we get another error. Your code looks a little bit off. And if we read the question carefully, it's not a list of numbers. It wants the absolute value of -42. So that's why it's important to also read instructions. So let's put in -42, and the absolute function is just going to take away that minus. So let's click run, and we see the absolute value of -42 is just 42.